So it's 7:01. So let's start, no? So thank you for joining us tonight. Probably medyo kakaiba yung title in the sense na when we hear about the term wedding photography, it's usually on the technique and the aesthetics, no? Although we're still going to discuss that in part, we might have to say some things na beyond the image. Okay, so let's just do the run through, no? Para then for the benefit of those who are going to listen this in the format in the podcast format. Philippine wedding photography is usually framed as an intersection of love and memories, wherein the celebration of the covenantal bond is seen as an event intrinsically carrying value due to the amorous dispositions demonstrated in the ritual. Hence, such activities merit photographic documentation, which in many respects also supports the lasting quality of and associations to both phenomena, the marriage and the photograph. Nevertheless, visual analysis of contemporary wedding photography in the Philippines would reveal, as our guest would argue, something more sublime that goes beyond the manifest surface of these images. As the title suggests, wedding photography from around 2000 to 2023 carries with it visual load that is not only a demonstration of aesthetic judgments by photographers, but is more encompassively representative of our Filipino subconscious. So, thank you for joining us tonight for episode 9 of the Marites Talks Kwentuhan sessions on Philippine photography entitled Contemporary Wedding Photography and the Filipino Subconscious. We have artist, educator, and wedding photographer Miss Sandra Dance from the Fine Arts and Visual Communications Department of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. This is Photography Chismis PH. So as you would see, medyo nag-grow na yung ano natin, yung project natin. So originally we had around 100 to 200 people. Now it's more than 1,100 na. So thank you for the millions and millions of people who are supporting us. And then reminders and notices. So this is a recorded Zoom session. You will be prompted by Zoom for your consent in the recording of this material. Number 2, the recording shall be uploaded to Photography Chismis PH and its various platforms such as, but is not limited to, Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify for educational purposes in the aim of contributing to the discourse of photography in the Philippines. So it sounds a bit lofty and a bit academic, no? Pero, well, that's the goal of this project. So this episode of the Kwentuhan session shall not be monetized. So derived knowledge from this program should be cited accordingly based on the conventions and laws on intellectual property in the Philippines as applicable. And then lastly, this Kwentuhan session is an informal discussion and is not a lecture. Comments and questions shall be recognized accordingly by the host or moderator as applicable. Recently then, nagkaroon na rin tayo ng IG, but that's the part of Photography Chismis that's image-based. So, as I mentioned a while ago, the podcast is available in Spotify and YouTube and Apple Podcast. However, Apple Podcast doesn't have video, no? And then our home is in Facebook. So the original home of Photography Chismis is in Facebook. So nandun yung mga writings, some of the events, yung mga postings namin ng events and analysis. Like for example, tomorrow there's going to be Art in the Park. So we have information about that in Facebook. So we also have postings on photography books that are released. Okay, with that, no, so contemporary wedding photography in the Filipino subconscious. Thank you, Sandra. So again, na-mention ko naman kanina na we really appreciate that you are giving time. It's a Saturday night, but you're here, no?
No problem. Thanks for having me, Tony.
Prior to starting this conversation, we were chatting about the overall feel and siguro the tone of the topic. Siguro I would ask first, what does contemporary wedding photography tell us about our Filipino subconscious? And if ever, what general statements can we make about it?
Siguro, before I answer this question or before we dive into it, I'll bring up what I mentioned to you earlier, which is that I find this a little bit of a tricky question to answer because of how it's phrased. No? What are the general statements we can make about the Filipino subconscious based on contemporary wedding photography? Ang feeling ko lang parang masyadong broad na concept yung Filipino subconscious for us to make a general statement based on one thing. Because the subconscious encompasses, ano ba, ilan na ba tayo? 100 million 100 million Filipinos, di ba? I mean, obviously, we do have certain things in common and that's what makes us Filipino. Pero ang feeling ko lang, it's hard to draw these conclusions. Especially because wedding photography as a practice is or tends to be concentrated in certain socioeconomic classes, or at least yung pinaka-visible na wedding photography, or at least the kind na tinitingnan ko as an academic or as a researcher, tends to be from a certain socioeconomic class. It's a little harder, especially on the internet, to have access to photographs that are taken na parang na non-mainstream, I would say, or that when the wedding photographer is maybe not as popular, or even coming from a different part of the Philippines, yung mga non-Luzon based na wedding photographers tend not to have as much visibility, diba? So factors like that all come in, which makes it difficult to make a general statement about the Filipino subconscious based on it. But siguro what I will say is that there are aspects of wedding photography that tell us about maybe what Filipinos aspire for, no? Kung ano yung aspirations ng natin as a group. But even then, that's pretty broad, and I would be hesitant to make a blanket statement in that regard, no? Pero siguro yun yung the best answer that I have for this question is it tells us something about aspirations, both in terms of your personal life, right? Like weddings are very personal, and we'll get into all of this personal versus public stuff perhaps later on. Pero as well as economical. Kung ano yung mga economic aspirations ng mga pamilya at mga tao dito na kikita din siya sa wedding photography. Do you have insights on this?
When we had our conversation, I think we started talking about it parang January pa yata. I mean, we started with something else. We started with a different topic. Nevertheless, when we finally decided on the topic, I also had questions in the sense, when we think of the subconscious, it feels like we're in the domain of what is typological and what is common to everyone. Then we put the word Filipino, similar to what you said. Now, that is a very layered concept. I mean, I knew naman na
Yeah.
I sinadya ko na leading para at least ma-reveal sa mga listeners. When we talk about Filipino, that is a very difficult topic in itself. Probably we can draw certain aspects of our human experience that is common.
Yeah, correct. I agree with that. Siguro, Tony, for me, what I would like to start with, because I come from a very specific background with wedding photography, and I can share it with you after you answer my question. I want to ask you something first, because I don't know much about you. I don't think we really know each other very well outside of parang the few Facebook exchanges that we've had. Pero maybe you can tell me what your impression is of wedding photography in the Philippines. What do you see that is common, or ano yung, I guess, yung general impression of the industry, or the kind of images that come out of contemporary wedding photography? What do you see?
Yung pinaka-recent and siguro mas broad siguro na point na observation ko obviously would be the tools that we're using prior to immersing myself again in the non-corporate and non-commercial aspects of photography. I was handling a camera brand for around siguro mga 3 to 4 years, and then prior to that, my stay there was in the professional market. My career was really to provide access to equipment for professionals. Obviously, pinaka-common, it's digital. So I think your research also covers that, no? That same period. But aside from the tools that we use, I observed in that 11 years, wedding photography was associated with economic classes. When we think of Philippine wedding photography, or at least the general idea in our heads, is the wedding photography of the rich people. When you go to the wedding photography groups, that thing that carries a brand of a photographer is the clients that they take on.
Right.
Kaya ang nangyari, merong stratifications in the sense na merong nagko-cover ng celebrities, align siya dun sa observation mo na when we talk about in wedding photography industry, it's also analogo siya in the sense na pati yung stratifications of that industry is based on a social economic class. Yun yung pinaka general observations na observe ko. When it comes naman dun sa tendencies on the aesthetics, nag-change din siya kasi before parang dati you have to have lights during film times at saka the early part of digital photography. The aesthetics was a bit different in the sense that you had to bring lights. When the capacity to shoot in high ISOs were made available in the camera, suddenly the aesthetics also changed. And so the aesthetics and also the tone, the feel of
Right.
the image nagbago rin. So it's obvious naman na that the technology also goes hand in hand with the aesthetics. Yun yung
Right.
napansin.
I asked simply, Tony, to set a baseline, no? Because I think everyone approaches the idea of wedding photography from different places, depending din on your exposure, no? So I was not exposed to wedding photography before I became a wedding photographer or before I started assisting or started working in wedding photography. Wala akong exposure. I was fresh out of college. Tapos sabi ko, what job will let me take photos and also will allow me to travel? So sabi ko, okay, wedding photography seems like the most obvious way because I'm not really a photojournalist. Di ako magaling I was not experienced doing long-term documentary or all these things that you're seeing. Wala akong interest in it so much, and I felt like wedding photography had a lot of marami kasing you have to be good at a lot of styles in order to carry off being a wedding photographer, right? Like you have to know how to do portraits. Kailangan marunong ka mag-still life kasi kukunan mo yung mga gamit. Kailangan marunong ka mag-action. Kailangan marunong ka parang in a sense, kailangan mo rin matuto mag-fashion kasi kailangan yung damit nila kita, di ba? So there's a lot of, may food pa, di ba? Parang iba-iba talaga. So I felt like that was very exciting for me. So I applied as an assistant to a wedding photographer. I did a lot of weddings with him. And then after nun, I started shooting on my own. So my exposure started with shooting. Hindi ako nagtitingin ng you mentioned celebrity weddings, and those are kind of a huge deal nga. You're right. Parang when a studio gets a celebrity client, parang sa kanila, eto na, sisikat na tayo. Medyo ganun yung nila, yung attitude nila about it, which I think is, it makes sense because you get posted, you get shared, everyone wants to see what this love team's wedding looks like or whatever. So you get a lot of press. So and the photographer I was shooting for had a lot of those clients. So parang sa akin, it was very like high stakes. Tsaka what I walked away from that experience with was it's very glamorous, no? Yung wedding photography kasi yung bride lahat they'll have in-airbrush yung mukha nila, like they'll have all the stops are pulled out. They are looking their absolute best. Tas hindi pwedeng may kulang sa submission. So you have to shoot everything. Lahat nung parang may mga template sila that they will train you to create on the day, right? So it's like group shots. Okay, parents only, mom only, dad only, mga kapatid, and there's all of this like there's these small things na you have to be trained into. You cannot just become a wedding photographer from nothing. You really need to go through the practice and the training to learn what people expect from you on that day. So yun yung start nung yung exposure ko to wedding photography. So in my head it was okay, it's very stressful and glamorous and like there's a lot of artifice involved. Pero yung lumalabas na photos. Sorry?
Actually,
Sorry, what you say?
medyo theatrical nga. I mean, in the sense na there's a certain...
Oh, yeah. And I think in particular, at the time that this was around like early 2010s, very popular yung fashion style, like turning your wedding and your prenup shoot into a fashion shoot. So you'll have stylists, dami yung damit, and all of this. Like, it's very like elevated from who you usually are on a daily basis. So minsan nami-meet ko yung client, dadaan silang office magpipick up ng album. So parang, ganyan pala itsura mo. I was staring at your face all day and it was so different with all of this makeup on. So that was my first experience with wedding photography. No, it felt very I don't want to cast it in a negative light, but in my head, I left wedding photography kasi for a few years. When I went to grad school, I realized maybe it's not for me because I actually do not enjoy how much artifice is involved in crafting wedding photographs. Maybe it's not for me. I don't think I'm the right person to do this kasi naano ako parang it rubs me the wrong way. Something about it is off. And then when in grad school I started to unpack it's because we end up having to align our images with a lot of these yung sinasabi ko na templates. Yung mga templates na yun come from very traditional, old-fashioned, conservative places na baka hindi lang na-verbalize ng mga tao, that people just kind of pass it along without thinking about what it means. Like, what does it mean to have to photograph the bride na laging kailangan her eyes are like pointing downward, her lashes are like fluttering, diba? Very sorry to use this word, but this is the word that really I would use to describe, like very virginal yung dating nung photographing a bride versus a groom who's very like, this is my watch and these are my shoes and this is my wallet. It's very like, I'm so rich. Look at this woman I bought. You know, parang yung naging feeling ko lang after some time doing it that way, I felt very, I struggled a lot with that kind of image making. And to be clear, I guess I also want to state this up front as I discuss this. I don't think that anymore. And I've kind of come to terms with what it means that people that people want a certain kind of imagery that goes along with their weddings. It isn't simply everyone's a misogynist. That's not why people do it. There's a lot of social reasons for these choices, no? And that is something that I am trying to uncover with my research now. I returned to weddings in 2017 because I was able to shoot. Long story short, this is a really long story, but I was able to shoot a wedding where everything went wrong, basically. It was a shoot in Palawan. Nasa island kami. Tapos, bumagyo, so we weren't able to go to the island where the wedding was supposed to be. My backup photographer's plane crashed, like literally sumubsob sa runway. Yeah, it was. Can we swear? Or is this like a clean pod? It was a fucking mess. Sobrang gulo. Pero ano pa rin? Parang, so everything that you would expect to go right in a conventional wedding went wrong. But my photos were the best that they've ever looked. Because I was so engaged and I was so excited by the fact na, parang pwede palang ganito. Like, everything can go wrong, pero basta masaya yung couple, parang okay pa rin. You know, it's still a joyful thing. Like, all of these other things that we're doing are just nice to have. Pero, if you're working with the right couple, or if the attitude of people is in the right place, parang all of these disasters really nakaka-bad trip sila, but there's still a way to find joy in these situations. So for me, that's what ended up becoming my angle. I returned to wedding photography, kind of trying to attract couples like that parang, while they did want to have a nice wedding, parang medyo mas relaxed sila in terms of how it is portrayed or how it comes out in the images. Yun yung parang, I tried to market myself as that, but honestly, I'm not sure that is really working for me, like professionally. You know, I don't think that's the thing that I'm discovering as well. Is because even if a lot of things go wrong, people still need to project or still have the desire to project yung that the day went well, that things were, you know, that things were a certain way. And that's okay, diba? Parang I talk about this a lot and you know, I'll get people coming up to me afterwards apologizing for parang, I'm so sorry we can't hire you because we parang well, conservative kami, kailangan mas traditional yung approach. Para sa akin sila nagsasorry. Like, it's as if I will take it against them if this is what they desire for themselves. And I really don't. I really don't. Parang ko na lang yun. Analysis ko na lang siya of the kinds of images that come out of wedding. So I say all these words without judgment, yung artifice or polish. These are not qualitatively bad. I don't think that people are fake and wrong or whatever misogynistic for wanting these things. No. But I guess just to set the stage, no, Tony, that's my background. That's how I came into wedding photography and why I'm interested in it. No, because I did have to be in it for a while, then leave, then come back in a way that made sense to me in order to really figure out that there was as a photographer that I have kind of a different objective maybe than I used to, which was just to how can a client pay for my flight to Boracay? The answer was to shoot their wedding back then, but now it's more of how can I be a part of this day and provide them with the kinds of images that are not only pleasing to them, like aesthetically or personally or whatever, but that they feel like they can share, that have a social function, or that fulfill whatever social function wedding photographs are meant to fulfill. So yun, is that okay? Sorry if I went on for too long, pero
Okay
yun
lang,
yung that's where I'm coming from.
Interesting nga yan kasi I mean since we're in the business of setting foundation or at least laying down the foundations for the discussion. Kung tutusin, actually medyo malalim na rin nga yung napunta natin even with the foundations, no. It's actually interesting for me kasi kadalasan people might have that idea that all we do as academics is to criticize. Some people would think na incompatible yung being aware of the images that you look at and then the images that you shoot. Meron ng may type, may na parang may stereotype na rin academic na parang all we do is criticize and analyze and it's all intellectual in the sense na in the real world put a teacher in the field hindi makakapag-shoot. And I think that your situation is you are from UP, you're teaching Viscom and fine arts, and yet you have a lot of insights on the practice of wedding photography aside from your academic background because you are shooting, you are a professional.
To be fair rin, Tony, I guess this is a tangent na rin, no, about pedagogy. Pero sa UP kasi mandated kami to practice. No, it's part of the mandate of the university that our professors are still engaged in the industries that they are part of. So gustuhin ko man na di na ako mag-shoot, di talaga pwede. I think the belief is that it's part of what makes you a good teacher is being plugged into the industry. So yun, gustuhin ko man di ako makaalis.
Yeah, parang it informs talaga the approach and also the content, the insights that we put into our classes. If we're practicing na.
Sure.
So prior ako, since you asked about my background din kanina, aside from corporate, that for some people might have been surprised na I am now doing gallery work when in fact I came from corporate. And then I told you kanina before we went online na actually prior to Canon, I was a product of the gallery system. I was from Silver Lens. So siguro to connect lang sa previous conversation natin. Yun lang siguro for those who will be listening to the podcast and for our live audiences, that's our background. So in a way hindi naman kami totally detached.
Yeah.
We're teachers kaya all we do is talk. It's not that. So we really came from from the practice.
Well, I also wanted to set the foundation for why I am interested in wedding photography at all, no? Parang hindi lang siya some passing interest na nakita ko lang sa Instagram, naisip ko siyang aralin. This actually comes from a very personal experience for me of being trained in wedding photography and doing all of these weddings. And then parang having an existential crisis about what I was shooting, no? Kasi particularly, I don't like to make it about gender, but I cannot help it. Kasi siya it cannot be dismissed na especially at the time when I started shooting, sobrang bihira ng babaeng nag-shoot. I was very I was one of the few at the time, no. But now there's definitely more, no. And as I do my research on wedding photography in the Philippines, I speak to a lot of female wedding photographers. Pero in the early 2010s, I couldn't name a studio that was headed by a woman. Like now you have like Jaja and so many, which is great. Kasi at least mas nagiging diverse yung perspectives. And I think that's really visible in how the aesthetics of wedding photography has shifted in the past maybe 10 years. But back then, I would say the gaze was primarily male. It was coming from it was coming from a lot of men who were shaping the imagery in the industry. And I don't want to put any malice on them naman. I don't think these men were being like rubbing their hands together and going like, I'm gonna make this woman look like a virgin, whatever. Although I must say I did encounter some of that while shooting. Na ang instruction nila sa bride is kunyari virgin ka pa, na parang ang sarap suntukin, di ba? I mean, I don't know. I see a laughing emoji in the crowd. Pero may mga ganun talaga, may mga bastos din. No, but I will say it's rare. It's rare for anyone out there that's like planning to get married. That's rare, and it didn't happen a lot, but it has happened around me that there are practitioners that will say rude things. But I think that a lot of the templates have been shaped by the patriarchal perspective that a lot of wedding imagery in general emerges from. You know, the fact na yung bride needs to look like a birthday present, di ba? Nakabalot siya, tapos pagdating niya dun sa groom, she's unwrapped. You know, all of these very subtle signifiers that come from a wedding tradition that might not reflect how people see themselves anymore, but that communicate to your society or to your community that you are getting married, right? And that's another thing that that comes up in my research a lot when I do reading about this in other contexts. Most of the writing on this is in American context, no. Pero yung fact kasi is wedding photography is both a personal practice and a public practice. So may personal function siya in the sense na it means to serve as a memory bank for the clients, right? They want to remember this day. It's very important. A marriage contract or the wedding ceremony is a public declaration of a personal commitment, di ba? So it needs to serve both of those functions. It needs to function personally. It needs to be a good reminder for the couple of what happened that day, but it also needs to signify publicly to your community that you got married. People, parang walang point in getting married if nobody knows you got married, diba? So, and this needs to be visible in the images, right? So you need some signifiers there that communicate to everyone what's going on. So, some of the ones that have stayed, no, I think less and less siya ngayon because people are starting to parang customize their symbols for their wedding day a little bit more. Pero things that are common are like the white dress. Diba? The white dress has stayed, even if it does not necessarily signify what it used to. It signifies now wedding. It signifies we're getting married. So a lot of women will still opt to wear a white dress, even if maybe they're not aware of what it used to mean or ano yung significance niya historically, or even if they're not super aligned with that. Pipiliin pa rin nilang mag-white para yung pictures nila, mukha silang kinakasal and people know that it happened. So yeah. So that I think that's an interesting interplay din eh, to have to satisfy both a personal objective for your client and also a community or public one. That I think is the struggle that I was able to identify. Sorry, Tony. Sige, go lang.
I'm curious ako kasi, for example, you mentioned yung the term signifiers, no? And I was thinking probably the wedding photography to a certain extent carries the same visual load or the same similar signifiers, even the signified has changed because the marriage itself, the ritual itself also normalizes certain roles and personalities and myths. You mentioned a while ago that the female in the couple would wear white. And if we look at it in the tradition of, let's say, at least let's say, for example, Judeo-Christian marriages, the white in the marriage ritual would usually have its own signifier and may personal dimension and mayroon din siyang social and religious, no? So inisip ko
Yeah.
baka part of it really is hindi mo siya talaga medyo hirap siyang i-divorce. Ang interesting din ng term, no? Ang hirap i-divorce, even the language that we have in a discussion. Ang hirap
Yeah.
i-divorce
Yeah.
the aesthetics and the myths that you create in
Yep.
wedding photography because the ritual
Yeah.
itself stands for the same.
Yeah.
It
There's
normalizes certain
a
ideas.
there's a scholar named Chris Ingraham. I'm gonna pull up my notes on her writing because she writes a lot about weddings in the US. And one of her essays, I would say essay or a paper that she published, is called Ritualizing Heterosexuality Weddings as Performance. And it's one of my key readings for the writing that I'm doing now on wedding photography because it's a little hard to find, so I don't know how I can share this with people. I probably can't because I just borrowed the book from a library and then I had to give it back to read it. But I can read you guys to go to a passage from it, no? So in the paper, Chris Ingraham is very scathing about weddings in general, as she here's what I wrote about it. Chris Ingraham eviscerates traditional wedding practices by contextualizing all of it in what she calls the heterosexual imaginary. She's pretty ruthless about this, saying that normalizing a specific kind of coupling and only giving benefits to those who participate in heterosexuality, and even just asking couples what their marital status is when it is irrelevant to the discussion are ways in which we are socialized into heterosexuality. So, in a way, yung wedding ritual is also ritualized heterosexuality. It's a way that we normalize a specific way of being in our society. It's our way of signifying to people in the society that, we have these appropriate values. These are our morals. These are the things that we value. This is what's important to us. We're proclaiming this in front of God, diba? Or what depends on what religion you are. And I'm glad you brought that up as well because there are differences in how our country executes this ritual as well. Pero most importantly, we're showing our community that we are appropriately gendered. No? Bihira kang makakita ng bride na nakapants. Bihira siya. It happens. I mean, it's more common now in like the 2020s or late 2010s. Pero before talagang even a short dress on a bride was quite uncommon, no? But it's I would say that it's comforting to see that these practices are being pinapasabog siya nung mga people who are getting married in the current generation. No? Millennials na siguro yung batch na kinakasal ngayon. Millennials and older Gen Z couples are the ones that are getting married now. And they're tending to, well, maybe it's hard to generalize. No? I can't say that. But I'm seeing more na mas nagiging visible yung mga couples who are not aligning themselves with a lot of these markers of hegemony that the wedding ritual tends to it tries to, what's the word? Ang pangit ng word na indoctrinate. Hindi yun eh. Parang ano lang. Yung pinopromote niya, ganon. Pinopromote na way of being nung the traditional ritual. But also, yun nga, Tony, I also want to bring up no, that a lot of this has to do with visibility, right? Because of who is shooting and then the kinds of weddings that they're shooting. Parang Christian and Catholic weddings are the most visible. Obviously because of the makeup of the country. Pero, I don't see a lot of Muslim weddings. Diba? Parang I don't see a lot of them represented in the wedding photography sphere. Parang medyo rare siya. I see some Indian weddings. They apparently happen. I've shot one. But apparently there are multiple day events and I've only been on one day. So very limited yung experience ko with Indian weddings. And then there's also indigenous people and how they get married, which also looks very different. And I don't think that they're able to hire, diba, yung mga 100,000+ costing wedding photographers to shoot their indigenous weddings. So there's a lot of the practices are very varied throughout the country, but the visibility only tends to be centered around one or two kinds of practices.
So yung
Yun.
so given that, no, in a way you are parang making a contradistinction in the sense that you are implicitly, I mean, not implicit, actually you're very explicit in saying na um in the representation, if you go to the genre or at least the domain of photography, specifically in wedding photography, there are also experiences and traditions and cultures that are not quote unquote represented. You don't see it as much. So where would you, ano yung reason for it? What do you think would be the reason why we don't have Muslim wedding photography seen as much or influence weddings?
Cultural, ano yan eh, parang it has to do with the cultural bias, I guess. Some of it is colorism and colonial, the side effects of colonialism tend to be that we prefer things that look more like the stuff our colonizers wanted to see from us, no? So, you see the very like traditional Catholic weddings, diba? It reminds you of the way that some of the practices have been absorbed from the Spanish when they were here, right? And then you have I would say Christian, yung parang yung wala sa Catholic Church na Christian type of wedding. Those tend to look more American. Diba? Mas American yung approach nila, both in like the things that are said at a wedding as well. Like I cannot repeat them. I don't have all my notes on this exactly, pero ano kasi yan, Tony, but I'm sure you know that weddings are composed of like a buttload of suppliers, diba? Hindi lang naman yung photographer yung in charge of creating the symbology or the lexicon of symbols that shows up at a wedding. It's a lot of people. The florist, diba? Even the rules ng church, sa loob ng church, kung anong pwedeng shoot, anong pwedeng hindi, yung itsura ng dress, hairstylists, even the videographers. Actually, yung videographers and photographers at weddings work very closely together. Parang they get a lot of the same shots, no? So I would say that videographers and photographers are both kind of hold a lot of responsibility for indexing and tracking a lot of these visual symbols that show up in weddings, no? From the flowers to yung presence of the ring bearer, the way itsura ng rings, and all of the symbols that couples tend to gravitate to are not always the brainchild of the couple, diba? And that's also something that I wanted to share with you today, no? That we talk about this as a Filipino subconscious thing, forgetting that a lot of couples, most couples, I would say 98% of couples that are getting married are first timers in the Philippines, diba? Dahil walang divorce, everyone that gets married, it's usually their first time to get married. So wala silang alam. So they will tend to default to whatever the suppliers will suggest, diba? Ano ba dapat? I've heard brides ask over and over, ano ba dapat yung gagawin? Saan ba dapat hahawakan? Ano ba dapat itsura nito? Diba? Because we don't know. We usually will have minimal experience from like, kung kinasal na yung ate mo, kung yung nag-bridesmaid ka ba sa best friend mo, ganyan. You can kind of absorb some of it, but until you're a bride or until you're the one getting married, you don't actually realize how much stuff you need to think about. Diba? From kung ano ba dapat itsura ng rings to like, ano ba dapat yung mga dinadala sa church, like, they'll require you to bring some stuff down the aisle or like assign people to light candles and all of these things. Like, hindi mo siya kayang alamin unless you work in the industry or you do a lot of research beforehand, which not a lot of people will do. So they'll tend to default to the wedding coordinator and say, ma'am, ano ba yung kailangan? Sino ba kailangan dito? Ano yung babayaran? Ganyan. Ano dapat itsura neto? So suppliers are also very responsible for a lot of the way that the things get passed down, which traditions or which symbols stay and which get eradicated. A lot of it is in the hands of the suppliers as well.
Given what you said, no, so the myth or anyway, so for the lack of a better term, yun,
Mm.
the myth that is created in the wedding images and the symbols is not necessarily, as you said, hindi rin siya totally brainchild nung couple, no?
Hmm.
Pero
Oo.
if that is the case, then I'm curious. So when we talk about the Filipino subconscious, based on what you said, it points towards that trajectory. There's a role of that wedding photographer in propagating
Mm.
that typology, in the sense that
Oo.
yung images, the symbols that is
Mm.
carried through the photographic image.
Yeah.
A huge part of that Filipino subconscious that is reflected in the image is not from the couple themselves.
Right. Kasi unless the couple feels really strongly about it, like I've had couples or I've had brides say, I really don't want to wear white. As in, ayoko yung meaning niya historically, so I'm not going to do it. Unless they are vehemently opposed to a certain thing, hindi naman nila kukontrahin or questionin eh. 'Di ba? Parang, oh sige, doves, why not doves, right? Like, why not throw rice at us? Why not do a money dance, 'di ba? If it's not hurting anyone, well, people don't tend to will not tend to object, right? Or unless they're being charged or something, 'di ba? So, yes, I would say wedding photographers carry a lot of weight in that regard. But also, I will say, I don't think a lot of us realize it. No, I don't think we realize the significance of including the wallet when we take pictures of the details on the groom side, di ba? Ano ba yung significance na kinukunan ko yung sapatos ng lalaki? Anong significance na kinukunan ko yung relo niya? 'Di ba? Kailangan ba maalala niya yung itsura ng relo niya with a picture? Is that why I'm doing it? Or have I just been trained to do it? Because I just have there's nothing to shoot in the groom side, so I might as well shoot whatever he has. 'Di ba? So a lot of it is not ano eh. I would say that again, it's not malicious, right? Wedding photographers are not sinister like rubbing their hands together trying to manipulate the Filipino subconscious. A lot of it is just passed down without much examination. Having said that though, parang I haven't talked to enough wedding photographers to really examine this. I will also say that I'm trying to talk to informants to make my paper or my writing about this topic more diverse and more accurate. So I only know people I've talked to who tend to agree with me, diba? So I want to know like what photographers say who shoot for lower income couples. What do they tend to think about this? Or is it napag-iisipan ba nila? I will say that this is a very narrow perspective at this point for me, kasi to say that they don't think about it. Di ko rin masabi for sure kasi I haven't talked to many people, but I'm working on that. That is my objective this year, is to kind of uncover the psyche of a lot of these other wedding photographers.
Going to your paper, pero I understand we cannot go into it in
Yeah, because it's
detail
not done.
because it's not done.
I have 4 pages, you know.
Yun, so yun, at saka to a certain extent also, it's hard then to talk about the general idea kung it's not, hindi pa tapos yung research, it's not done until it's presented, no? Pero
Yeah.
nevertheless, siguro based on our conversation, when we were trying to think about this topic, specifically we periodized, we gave a period when we say contemporary Philippine photography. Sorry, contemporary photography. We're in more or less around 2000 to 2023.
Yeah.
2010.
Yeah.
Tama ba?
Yeah. Well, that's what we discussed, but I would think at whatever point digital photography was kind of normalized is the point that I'm more,
Okay.
I would say, qualified to speak about. Kasi yung film practices, parang hindi ko na masyado naabutan. Tsaka hindi ako masyadong familiar dun sa industry and how it transformed from back then. So, yun. So, yeah.
Since yun nga, so in our conversation, you mentioned na 2000 to 2023. However, instead of the specific year, you were trying to yung contemporaneity of digital photography with the practice of wedding photography, and more or less parang that is the period that you're covering in your research.
Mhm.
Given that, ako naman personally, ang naalala ko, since kami yung mga ano, 'di ba? I mean, pagpasok ko sa
Suppliers.
brand,
Oo.
2000 around 2004, 2005, dun talaga talagang ano yung digital photography, because that was the first time nagkaroon ng full frame digital
Right. Oo, DSLR.
na
Oo.
na may video. Pero nevertheless, if that is the case, so are we also saying that in your consideration of what is contemporary and also in the consideration of what is Filipino subconscious, ano yung relationship ng technology with the Filipino subconscious, if we're saying that it happened contemporaneously?
You know what? I would say, Tony, that it has less to do with the devices or the actual equipment that we used to shoot and more to do with social media. Because once photographs started being easier to share over social media and it became a part of the wedding photography um, deliverables, yung parang kailangan um, meron tayong small edit for really soon or the day after the wedding para may ma-post yung couple. 'Di ba? Yung para may ma-post is a whole ano siya eh, parang hindi natin siya um hindi siya consideration in the film generation or even earlier generations of the internet, like before everyone was on Facebook. Now it is. 'Di ba? Yung sequencing ng images, what will look good in the thumbnail or ano yung magandang i-profile pic. I've got to be honest here, Tony, as a wedding photographer, and I really hope my clients who might have been listening don't take this the wrong way. But I take it kind of personally pag di nila ginagawang profile pic yung photos from the wedding. That's how I know na parang, oh, I feel like they might have not liked my shot.
Yung
Well,
nagustuhan, bakit nila hindi ginamit no?
diba? Parang
Oo.
that. But I mean, obviously, there's different reasons. Some people also don't, diba? Parang some people just won't do it or they like their profile. Whatever. It's just a stupid thing that happens I'm a very insecure wedding photographer. But it's something that I pay attention to is how are they posting it? Did they share it? Is it private? Is it public? Diba? Did the bridesmaid use the photo that I took of her, eating lechon as a profile pic? Why or why not? Sabi niya, gagamitin niya daw, diba? So it becomes such a major part of how these photos exist. And that community aspect, yung aspect na readable siya ng community mo as wedding photographs becomes even more important. Kasi dati, piprint mo lang siya, lalagay mo sa bahay mo. Hindi naman siya nalalagay sa dyaryo di ba? So, in a way, it's even less important before for it to be readable by other people as wedding photographs. But now that we have the social media generation and, it's so important for couples to have something to post. Kailangan malinaw yung nangyayari. The other thing I've observed that it's harder for couples who are not married to just do a photo shoot anymore. Like if you just want to have a photo shoot with your jowa, just post mo yun, everyone's gonna think you got engaged. Diba? Laging parang ano to, prenup ba yan? Like everyone, may context na for why are you doing this? Ba't kayo nagpo-post, diba? Kung wala lang, parang, may ganun ba? Pwede ba yun? Pwede bang wala lang tayong reason to show affection on the internet? People will always read into it. No? So it's very important to be clear in what's happening. And I feel like that has an effect on the symbols, right? The symbols that become perpetuated because it becomes about how readable are they in the social media context. So I feel like that's the impact. Has more to do with sharing than shooting. Yan.
Good point. Yung ano rin kasi parang isa din sa nakikita ko is yung the media to which or to where we propagate the symbols, it's not the camera itself, it's the way we communicate as a community.
Yeah.
So that plays more of a role than the camera itself. And although syempre may contributions pa rin din naman since the fact na naging digital siya, then technically it's attributable to a certain extent that now that it's digital, then you can put it in a digital network, which is social media.
Right.
More or less, it's a very good point that you mentioned yung social media, no?
Pero tama ka rin mentioned, Tony, about yung fact, kunyari, that cameras are able to shoot in lower light now. Means na, kunyari, hindi ako, let's go backwards. Dati, as a photographer, very dependent ako sa ilaw ng video pagdating sa reception. Kasi sa reception, I guess videographers just need more light than photographers because they're shooting continuous, so they need the lights to be set up right. And ako, nakadepende ako sa ano ba ginagawa nila. Shoot ko na lang kung ano yung inilawan ng video. And that was fine. But now that camera sensitivity has gone up, I can actually shoot a wedding without a videographer. Diba? So if a couple wants super intimate na wala ng video, kaya ko pa rin na ako lang. So parang may small aspects like that. Like I can get asked to shoot more intimate setups than before. But siguro yung impacts niya in terms of the visual tropes or the symbols that get incorporated into weddings is not yet clear, or baka makikita pa natin siya a little further down the line. Yan.
At saka na-realize ko din, to a certain extent, even if you are provided that capability of shooting lower light, and then probably you can demonstrate a more intimate visual message because of the low light capabilities in a way that is still contingent to the message and the typologies that the tropes that you mentioned. It's still contingent to that. So although it has a relationship, that's a good point na probably may connection but medyo unclear pa yung connections.
I would also say that, Tony, that it becomes more revealing as well about the priorities of the couple, no? So a couple that doesn't mind that you nakasakay ka with them in the car, right? You can get a different set of photos with a couple like that than a couple that is very parang distanced or very formal, that prefers that you only show up in the spaces na are publicly viewable. So hindi ka pinapasama dun sa back room or sa green room for the reception or all of these things, you know. So the kinds of photos you get are dependent a lot on the kind of client and how their level of comfort with you. Which I'm not sure. I feel like most people are pretty comfortable with having a photographer around, especially if you paid them to be around all day. So
meron din ako isa siguro pala na isa pang related activity during the wedding event that I'm not sure kung I know, let me know if yung observation mo, kasi you mentioned about the immediacy. So aside from having a camera that is digital, so and then you have a network communication channel which is social media, wherein you can share the images. Isa pang na-realize ko pala ngayon is during that time na naging na yung need to see the image right there and then, it was not necessarily also caused by photographers. It was because of the videographers, because when SDE was developed, I think in 2008 ba, yung the concept of an SDE, suddenly there is an expectation may expectation na after the event merong grand reveal during the reception. Before, you have photographs on the table, you buy your diba, bibili mo yan.
No, that's an interesting space to think about, no? Because my work when I first started, or yung entry point ko into wedding photography, is ako yung gumagawa ng mga SDE for my boss. Or in weddings, in photo, it's slideshows. So I was working on the wedding slideshows for him. I feel like those have actually gone out of style, but I'm not sure. Because again, I'm marketing to a different demographic now. I think those tend to be more popular with big weddings, or yung mga the 300 people weddings versus the smaller, more intimate ones na that have like 80 people tend not to ask for SDEs or slideshows. Parang hindi siya as important to that demographic. I also feel like maybe, well, it's hard to generalize. I think generally people enjoy them, but if asked, couples will say they don't. I'm not not sure if this is accurate across the board, but it's my experience that couples tend to say, or at least the couples that I've talked to about this tend to say, di kami super interested in the SPE. So I don't know if it's going out of style. It might have just been fashionable for a short while. Tapos, ngayon di na.
Sige. So siguro since time check tayo, so it's 8:07. I'll just ask one more question and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Yeah.
No? Since we're talking about a certain period and also we're making an assessment or analysis or in a way parang statements that would characterize that connection between Filipino subconscious and that period of digital, basta sabihin na let's 2000 to 2023. Tanong ko would be, since we're periodizing it, what would be your observations kung meron bang pagbabago when we think about yung description of the idea? In a way, parang we're still propagating the concept or at least the idea of the malakas and the maganda and the roles that is related to the malakas and the maganda mythology, no? Through economic achievements of the man, the potency of the man, and then you have the beauty and the look atness of the female form, no? So pero regardless of that, given that your research covers up to the present, what aspects or at least what tropes do you think are changing? Syempre the tropes, kaya sila tropes by definition, it's a certain characterization that it persists across time, no? But then again, what would be some contemporary changes in those tropes that you can share?
I would say, ano yung pinaka-obvious? It might have to do with the attire of the couple. Tends to be less formal, or marami na rin nagpapakita na less formal styles of attire seem to be coming into fashion. I would say as well, yung formality of the whole ceremony tends to also be a little bit more flexible now. Like you have like mga dancing entrances, di ba? Mga pumapasok yung mga groomsmen na sumasayaw. And I think this is due to social media as well, kasi it's something you can film and something you can share. So I see that happening a lot. Couples writing their own vows has become, parang people try to do it more now. Like I think Catholic churches still don't permit couples to have their own vows at the church. So what couples will do is they will give it either after the ceremony or in the reception. Magbabasa sila ng sarili nilang vows, no? So people are trying to personalize. So I'm seeing that the other thing is has to do with gender, I would say. Parang the gender of the bridal party hindi na super rigid in terms of parang ang tawag doon? Yung mga maid of honor, yung mga bridesmaid, hindi lahat babae lagi. And that tends to be parang starting to see that more and more in weddings where you have these sort of mixed gender bridal parties, and that's fine. Ano pa ba? Yung mga it still happens, but I also see less and less a lot of those wedding games in the reception. Yung mga the awkward ones where you try to pair up the single people, those are also starting to disappear. But they're being replaced by other games, parang other things. I also feel like Tony, parang yung pandemic may impact din siya on a lot of these practices. Ano ba? Mahirap kasi sobrang konti lang ng weddings na shoot ko nung pandemic kasi I was very cautious about COVID, so hindi ako tumatanggap talaga. I shot maybe less than 5 in the past 3 years. So hindi siya super visible from the supplier side sa akin kung ano yung nagbabago. But obviously, COVID has made everything smaller and made people, I think, hone in on only the things that really are important to them. So I think the pandemic had some good impacts on I think how people would structure their weddings, because they tended to prioritize na talaga. Ano ba talaga yung gusto natin? Sino ba talaga yung gusto nating invite? Ganyan. So yun. I don't think I answered that question very well. But again, I think I need to talk to more wedding photographers that are still shooting actively now to get a better feel for some of those things. But the ones I do, the few people I have interviewed, I asked them kasi kung ano yung mga tropes na nakikita nila that persist, that people will insist on even if they are super non-traditional. Because I interviewed photographers that shoot for parang these smaller studios that tend to lean more non-traditional in their photography style. So tinatanong ko, pag non-traditional yung at least yung intention ng couple, ano pa rin yung mini-maintain nila? Ano pa rin yung gusto nila? And the biggest thing is white dress and flowers. Parang those things will still show up. Those things still signify wedding even if everything is different. Nasa outer space sila kinakasal, tas yung groom naka Darth Vader helmet, yung bride naka white pa rin, tsaka may hawak pa rin na flowers. So yan.
What about kung paano pag same-sex marriage? May flowers pa rin?
You know what? Obviously, it's harder to read that here because they're not as common and people tend to not really have them. But I was reading an article by, this is an older article from an American writer. Anong pangalan nun? It was here, Remaking the White Wedding, Same-Sex Wedding Photographs Challenge to Symbolic Heteronormativity. So this is by a writer named Katrina Kimport. Tapos, dinescribe niya yung phenomenon in San Francisco way, way back. They legalized yung gay marriage for like 2 seconds and then they illegalized it again. Parang sobrang bilis lang. So, may parang short period na pinayagan sila. Parang 1 day or 1 week lang siya. And then, so it was like early 2000s before na-legalize siya across the US or at least in that state of California. So there was a short window. So yung window na yun, ang daming couples that went to yung mga huwes to get married like as fast as they could before the law was changed. So yung ginawa ng writer na to, inaral niya yung mga photographs ng mga same-sex couples who decided to get married on that day to see what could be observed from their photographs. Tapos yung napansin niya, pag same-sex na parehong male, yung outfits nila tended to be both coded as male. So they would both be in suits. Pero pag same-sex na babae, so a lesbian couple getting married, the tendency would be for one of them to be in a dress and one of them to be in a suit. So parang meron pa rin nag-exist na heterosexual coding even in same-sex weddings. At least back then, at that very specific period in time. And so her whole paper kind of interprets why or the possibilities kung bakit kaya nangyayari to na nagkakaroon pa rin ng coding in same-sex weddings. So interesting yon for me. I have yet to observe it really. Parang bihira yung nakikita ko na like I see some same-sex couples having parang ceremonial weddings here. But it's a lot less common. I hope it becomes more common for the record. I hope to see more of that.
Sobrang insightful nung I mean having Sandra, no. I mean again having having the research, doing the research about this topic and then also shooting, parang ang lawak. Siguro I would speak for all the guests and probably yung makikinig nito na parang sobrang insightful talaga nung sinasabi mo, no, Sandra. So we thank you very much. So before kami mag-close, we'll open. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said thank you. Thank you, Tony. I'm happy to be here.
So so before tayo mag-conclude, so meron bang questions sa live audiences? Wala. Wala. Okay, sige. So, ayan, yun. So merong reaction si Miss Dar. Si Miss Dar is also...
Dar.
Kilala mo si Miss Dar, no?
I think I follow you on Instagram. She sent me a PM, so thanks, Dar.
Ano yan, co-faculty ko sa Benilde.
Okay. Nice.
And also, she's an artist. And if you see yung work niya rin, medyo interesting din yung ano. I mean,
Yeah. For sure. Oh, pinalo ko na siya sa Instagram a long time ago. So, I'm a fan.
ayan. So walang questions ha. So we will be concluding the episode. So siguro since wala. So again, thank you Sandra no. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm
no problem.
badul kong i-ask kita for final words but I'm still going to ask. Do you have any final words?
Yeah, I do. No, I do. I think
Showbiz no.
for
Pinoy na Pinoy.
mostly for couples ito rather than wedding photographers. Wedding photographers should just do their jobs. Pero for couples, parang sana who are planning to get married or for whom marriage or a wedding is an option, sana makapagplano kayo ng wedding that you want and na hindi kayo magpapadala sa mga mga sinasabi nila na kailangan meron. That I my hope for everyone is that they're able to have the kind of wedding that makes them very happy to think back on it. Yon. So good luck everyone.
Yun, so with that, no, so everyone, thank you for joining us for tonight. And then for those who listened through the podcast, so thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thanks everyone and thanks Tony. I'll see you guys around.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.